What I'm talking about. Swamp Rat XIII was the first car that we operated with two-speed transmissions because the
one machine nearly ended the career of drag racing's greatest legend and in doing so revolutionized the sport forever. On March 8, 1970, Don Garlits' dragster, Swamp Rat XIII, exploded on the track. The blast cut off part of his foot and broke the car in half. It looked like the end of his racing career. But the real story isn't just about the crash. It's about how this deadly accident forced a change that made racing safer for everyone. By the late 1960s, Don Big Daddy Garlits was already more than just a racer. He was a symbol of American drag racing. Fans saw him as unbeatable, the man who could take on anyone and win. His cars, all nicknamed Swamp Rat, had become legends in their own right. Each one carried a number, marking the progress of his career and the evolution of drag racing technology. By the time he built Swamp Rat XIII, Don had already pushed the limits more than a dozen times. Every car was faster, louder, and wilder than the one before it. But behind the victories was a constant struggle. Racing wasn't just about speed, it was about survival. Swamp Rat XIII was not born out of calm planning or careful engineering. It came from desperation. In early 1970, Don's previous car, the Swamp Rat XIIB, was on its way back from a Canadian event. Sponsored by the famous Smothers Brothers, it was meant to carry Don into another season of glory. But fate had other plans. During transport, the chassis collapsed. The car was ruined before it even reached the track. With a big event, the NHRA Spring Nationals coming up in Dallas, Don had only days to act. This was where his team stepped in. Crew chief Tommy T.C. Lemons and skilled welder Connie Swingle worked side by side with Don. In just 72 frantic hours, they built a brand new dragster from scratch. They had missed the Dallas race, but the machine they created in those 3 sleepless days would become one of the most important cars in drag racing history. Swamp Rat XIII looked menacing. Its black paint made it seem almost alive, a predator waiting to strike. Under the body sat a supercharged 426 Hemi engine, a monster capable of making over 1,500 horsepower. It had the raw power to push the car beyond 225 miles per hour in under 7 seconds. For fans, it was terrifying and exciting. For Don, it was his best chance to stay on top of the sport he loved. But hidden inside its design was a flaw so dangerous that no amount of horsepower could hide it. Like every other dragster of that time, Swamp Rat XIII was a front-engine dragster. That meant the driver sat directly behind the transmission and clutch. If something broke, all of the shrapnel, flames and explosions would shoot straight toward the driver's legs and chest. Don and every other racer of that era knew this risk, but it was the only way dragsters had ever been built. The driver was, in a sense, a human shield protecting the machine. Looking back, this design feels insane, almost reckless, but at the time, it was simply how things were done. Drivers accepted the danger as part of the job. For Don, though, this was more than just risk. It was gambling with his entire career and life. Still, he had no choice. To walk away from drag racing would mean giving up everything he had worked for. So he climbed into Swamp Rat XIII, knowing full well that one mistake, one small failure, could end it all. The story of Swamp Rat XIII is not just about metal, horsepower, and explosions. It is also about human determination. Don's willingness to push forward, even when the odds were against him, shows how far passion can drive a person. But it also shows how often progress comes with a hidden cost. Swamp Rat XIII was not built to change the sport. It was built to survive another season. Yet in its very design, both powerful and flawed, the seeds of change were already planted. As Don prepared to unleash this machine on the drag strips of America, no one knew that its story would go far beyond wins and trophies. The real story was waiting beneath the surface, hidden in a secret that would soon come to light. While Swamp Rat XIII was born in chaos and desperation, it carried something hidden inside that would quietly reshape drag racing. Beneath its black frame and roaring engine sat an idea that few people in the sport had ever considered possible: a 2-speed transmission in a top-fuel dragster. At the time, dragsters had always been brutally simple machines. The goal was to keep them light and powerful: one gear, one direction, full speed. Anything more was thought to be extra weight or wasted time. But Don Garlits didn't see it that way. The idea came from frustration. At one race, Don had launched hard from the starting line, pulling ahead of his rivals in the first half of the track. But halfway down, his opponent's Dodge factory car caught up and passed him before the finish line. Don turned to his crew chief Tommy T.C. Lemons and said, "The gearing is too high for the tires, but I don't want to slow down at the top end. What we need is a transmission." It sounded almost crazy. A transmission in a dragster? Nobody had ever made it work before. Through cam grinder Bruce Crower, Don contacted Leonard Abbott, an experimental builder in California. Abbott had been working with old Ford overdrive units from 1949, turning them into crude two-speed transmissions. He shipped one of these unusual gearboxes to Chicago, where Don and his team quickly installed it in Swamp Rat XIII. The results shocked everyone. On its very first run, the dragster was 0.2 of a second faster. In drag racing, where wins are often decided by thousandths of a second, 0.2 was massive. Don knew he was sitting on a weapon that nobody else had, but he also knew that if the other racers found out, they would copy it instantly. So Don made a bold decision. He kept it a secret. Whenever someone asked about the strange sound coming from his car, he would shrug it off and claim it was just a reverser, a mechanism used to back the car up after a burnout. To sell the lie, his crew would even push the car back to the line by hand when the transmission failed to work. To the outside world, Swamp Rat XIII looked like any other dragster, but inside, it had a hidden edge. His secret worked for months, and Don collected wins while his rivals scratched their heads. But secrets never last forever in racing. During a test session at Indianapolis, legendary racer Don the Snake Prudhomme heard something unusual. He recognized the sound of gears shifting mid-track. Suspicious. Prudhomme made a phone call to California. That single call led to the birth of the Lenco Transmission Company, a business that would go on to dominate drag racing for decades. Don's hidden trick had just sparked a whole new industry. Looking back, this part of the story shows that innovation often comes from frustration and risk. Don wasn't trying to change the future of drag racing, he just wanted to win a race he thought he should have won. Yet his unwillingness to accept defeat led to an invention that changed how cars were built. For a brief moment, Swamp Rat XIII was not just another dragster, it was a symbol of possibility. Still, fate had its own plan. The very machine that carried this hidden gift also carried a deadly flaw. A flaw that would soon reveal itself in the most violent way possible, changing Don's life forever. March 8, 1970, began like any other race day at Lions Dragstrip in Long Beach, California. The sun was out, the crowd was excited, and Don Garlits was preparing to drive Swamp Rat XIII in the Top Fuel Finals. Still, fate had its own plan. The very machine that carried this hidden gift also carried a deadly flaw. A flaw that would soon reveal itself in the most violent way possible, changing Don's life forever. March 8, 1970, began like any other race day at Lions Dragstrip in Long Beach, California. The sun was out, the crowd was excited, and Don Garlits was preparing to drive Swamp Rat XIII in the Top Fuel Finals. He had been here many times before, and for fans it looked like just another showdown between the sport's biggest names. But beneath the surface, danger was quietly building inside his machine. In the semi-finals earlier that day, Don had already faced trouble. The rear end of the car had broken during his run, yet he still managed to win and move on to the finals. For the team, this was both good news and bad news. They were in the championship round, but the car was wounded. Crew chief T.C. Lemons and the team worked furiously to replace the broken parts. They also decided at the last minute to change the transmission. The fix was rushed. In their hurry, they forgot one important step: filling the transmission with enough oil. At first, no one thought this detail mattered, but in reality, the oil inside the transmission acted like a cushion. It absorbed shock if something went wrong. Without enough oil, the system was like a ticking time bomb. Don strapped into the car, unaware that his life was about to change forever. When the Christmas tree lights flashed green, Don launched hard. For the first moment, everything seemed fine. The Hemi roared, the tires bit into the track, and Swamp Rat XIII leapt forward. Then, in less than a second, disaster struck. The sprag in the transmission failed. The engine spun wildly out of control, forcing the transmission drum to turn backwards at nearly 30,000 revolutions per minute, 3 times faster than normal. At that speed, metal cannot hold together. The drum exploded with the force of a bomb. The blast ripped the dragster in half. Pieces of steel flew like shrapnel across the track. Flames burst out from underneath the car. Don's right foot was directly in line with the explosion. The blast severed all of the toes on that foot and tore through the cockpit. leaving him in unimaginable pain. The car slid down the strip in pieces. Don, still strapped in, was being dragged along with the wreckage. Fans gasped in horror as smoke filled the air. Track workers and safety crews ran toward the wreck. When they finally reached him, they found Don alive but terribly injured. His foot was mangled, his body was bloody, and many thought he would never race again. For a man who had built his life on speed and control, the crash was devastating. In just seconds, his career seemed finished. Doctors at Pacific Coast Hospital in Long Beach told him the reality. His foot would never fully heal, and walking alone would be a challenge, let alone racing at more than 200 miles per hour. But what no one realized in that terrible moment was that this explosion was not the end of Don's story. It was the turning point. Sometimes history changes in the blink of an eye, and sometimes tragedy plants the seed for progress. Swamp Rat XIII had destroyed itself, and nearly destroyed Don with it, but out of the wreckage, a new idea would be born. Lying in a hospital bed at Pacific Coast Hospital in Long Beach, Don Garlits had every reason to quit. His right foot was shredded, his body weak, and doctors told him the truth he didn't want to hear. His days as a drag racer were over. Most men would have accepted it. They would have retired, lived quietly and tried to move on. But Don was not like most men. Even in pain, even while his bandaged foot leaked blood, his mind was racing. Instead of feeling sorry for himself, he asked a simple but powerful question. There has to be a better way. That thought became the spark of a new era. With a pencil and scraps of paper, Don began sketching. The idea was radical, but also simple. Move the engine behind the driver instead of in front. If the transmission and clutch were no longer sitting directly in front of the driver's legs, then a failure like the one that nearly killed him would not end in disaster. Don wasn't the first to imagine a rear-engine dragster. A few racers had experimented with the idea before, but their cars were unstable. At high speed crashed. The concept had been left behind as too dangerous. Don, however, saw what others had missed. He believed that with the right balance, the rear engine design could not only work, it could be faster and safer than anything on the strip. During his 6 weeks in the hospital, he kept refining his sketches. His crew visited often, offering support and listening to his plans. To them it sounded like madness. Their leader was lying in a hospital bed, barely able to stand, and already dreaming of a machine that nobody else had ever perfected. But Don's determination gave them hope. If he wasn't giving up, neither would they. When he was finally discharged, his foot was still wrapped in heavy bandages. Walking was painful, but his mind was locked on the future. Don sold Swamp Rat XIII to his loyal friend and crew chief Tommy T.C. Lemons for $4,500. Lemons and welder Connie Swingle rebuilt the destroyed dragster and toured with it while Don recovered. This gave Don time to focus on designing his next vision, the car that would become Swamp Rat XIV, the first truly successful rear-engine top-fuel dragster. But Don's comeback wasn't just about engineering. It was about proving something deeper to himself, to his rivals, and to the sport. Racing had nearly taken his life, yet he refused to let it define his ending. Instead, he turned his suffering into invention. His story became a lesson in resilience. Sometimes pain is not the final chapter, but the beginning of something greater. The crash at Lions had been brutal, but it also freed Don from the limitations of tradition. He no longer saw himself as just another driver running the same kind of car everyone else had. He became a builder of the future. The man who once sat behind exploding parts was now leading the charge to put safety first, without sacrificing speed. By the end of 1970, Don was already working on Swamp Rat XIV. His injured foot would never fully heal, but it didn't matter. He had found a new purpose. What seemed like the end had become his turning point, a moment that would change not just his life, but the entire history of drag racing. Swamp Rat XIII may have been built in desperation, and it may have nearly ended Don Garlits' career, but its legacy became larger than any victory, trophy, or record. What happened on March 8, 1970, forced drag racing to evolve. That single explosion at Lions Dragstrip marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. After the crash, Don's idea for a rear-engine dragster quickly moved from sketches to reality. By early 1971, his new machine, Swamp Rat XIV, rolled onto the track. Fans were skeptical. Many people in the racing world doubted it would ever work. Rear-engine cars had failed before, often spinning out of control or losing traction. But Don's design was different. He had studied balance, weight distribution, and safety like never before. When the car finally raced, it proved that not only could a rear-engine dragster work, it could dominate. In just a short time, the sport followed his lead. Other racers, once critical, began building their own rear-engine cars. The front-engine dragster, the dangerous design that had nearly killed Don, quickly became a thing of the past. Within only a few years, every serious top-fuel team had switched to rear-engine layouts. What had once been seen as impossible had now become the standard. Meanwhile, Swamp Rat XIII didn't disappear. After Don sold it, the car changed hands several times. It was rebuilt, converted, and raced again in different forms. Eventually, Don bought it back for only $300 after spotting its distinctive roll bar at a race in 1976. For nearly 40 years, the car sat in his museum, surrounded by photographs of the crash, broken parts, and even the blood-stained helmet from that fateful day. Visitors didn't just see a machine, they saw a story, a reminder of how close one man came to death and how that moment saved countless others. In 2015, the car was restored one final time for a special exhibition. The restoration brought it back to life, not as a weapon of speed, but as a symbol of history. At a Cacklefest event, the engine fired once more, this time with Don's fiancée sitting safely in the cockpit. Protected by modern safety gear, she experienced the roar of a legend without the deadly risk that once defined it. Today, every top-fuel dragster, every pro mod, and every high-powered machine on the strip carries Don's legacy. Drivers sit ahead of the engine, shielded from the explosions and failures that once threatened their lives. The sport is still dangerous, but it is far safer because of one man's refusal to quit. The irony is clear. The crash that almost destroyed Don Garlits gave birth to the design that keeps others alive. The true measure of Swamp Rat XIII is not in the records it set, but in the lives it saved. Its story is not about how fast it went, but about what it forced drag racing to become. Progress often comes through tragedy, and in this case fire, blood and broken bones were the price of a safer future. So when fans watch a modern dragster roar down the strip at more than 330 miles per hour, they are seeing more than just speed. They are witnessing the legacy of Don Garlits, the man who turned disaster into invention. Swamp Rat XIII was the last of its kind, a deadly machine that had to destroy itself so that the sport could live. And that is the shocking truth. Sometimes the darkest moment does not mark the end. Sometimes it is the beginning of a better path. Swamp Rat XIII was never meant to be a legend. It was rushed, it was flawed, and it nearly cost Don Garlits his life. But history doesn't always remember the cars that win the most races. Sometimes it remembers the machines that change everything. This dragster wasn't just fast, it was deadly. It tore itself apart in front of thousands of fans, leaving its driver broken and bloody on the track. Many thought that was the end of Big Daddy Don Garlits, but instead, it was the start of something far greater. Out of fire, pain, and near death, he built the blueprint that saved drag racing. Think about that for a moment. Every time you see a top-fuel dragster scream past at over 330 miles per hour, with the driver sitting safely in front of the engine instead of behind a ticking time bomb, that's because of this one crash. The price of progress was blood, broken bones, and a man's refusal to quit. That's the real legacy of Swamp Rat XIII. It didn't just race down a strip of asphalt, it carried drag racing into the future. It forced an entire sport to evolve, and in doing so, it saved lives. What was once the most dangerous car in America became the reason drag racing is still alive today, and that's the shocking truth. Sometimes tragedy is the only way forward. Sometimes the story we remember isn't about winning trophies, but about refusing to give up when everything seems lost. Don Garlits turned disaster into invention, and that lesson stretches far beyond racing. It's about courage. It's about vision. It's about how one man's darkest moment became a turning point for everyone who followed. Now it's your turn. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes to a piece of racing history you never knew, do one simple thing. Hit the like button. It tells YouTube that this story matters and helps more fans discover it. Subscribe to the channel. There are so many more untold stories from the past waiting to be shared, stories just as shocking, just as inspiring. And don't just stop here. Check out the next video on the channel, because the story of drag racing is full of legends, tragedies, and inventions that shaped the sport we love. You've just heard the shocking truth behind Don Garlits' most dangerous machine. But trust me, this isn't the only hidden chapter in racing history. So buckle up, because the next story might be even wilder.